All right, I'm going to go ahead and quickly finish the domestic lecture for those 8 of you out there that are watching it. Thank you for sitting through it. So there was all these different movements going on in American history, kind of peaking in the 1960s, the Black Power movement, the Chicano movement, Women's Power movement, um, and even the gay rights movement. In fact, what ends up happening is that Stonewall, which was a gay bar in New York City, it was constantly being harassed by the police and different things to kind of undermine the gay community. In one evening in 1969, the patrons of Stonewall decide to fight back, and the fighting takes place in the streets, and it really becomes this seminal movement in the gay rights struggle. And you get this kind of big moment in that you have people openly resisting this constant harassment. It does begin the beginning of this gay rights struggle on a national level. There were instances and civil rights efforts before Stonewall, but it really kind of symbolizes this growing movement. The next year, the first gay and lesbian protest, march, pride, gay pride will take place, and it will become a tradition throughout the country and throughout the world, this acknowledgement of the struggle of gay and lesbian people for greater equality. And this will be a part of future years. This is the gay rights flag, and there's some symbolism there. And of course, this issue is nowhere near being done with Prop 8 and other different laws trying to undermine or define marriage, undermining the right of gay or lesbian people to get married. There's a bunch of other struggles that, once again, we're not going to get into. The greater acknowledgement for people with disabilities and things like that. A big part of the chapter, very important because they could tie it to foreign policies, the anti-war movement. Basically, because of the growing anger over the war in Vietnam, you get this growing anti-war movement, oftentimes referred to as the New Left. The New Left gets a lot of its support from those individuals who feel the Vietnam War is wrong. In fact, in 1962, you have the Port Huron Statement by Tom Hayden, which basically critiques American society, takes a look at the Vietnam War and the Cold War policies and the buildup of the military and all those different things. You have different groups forming. That on the left is a documentary about the anti-war movement, particularly in the colleges, but you have SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, who basically a bunch of people, liberals, who are very frustrated with the lack of change. They are committed to the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and other movements, the anti-war movement. So it's very scattered in different areas. There is a whole bunch of parts of the 60s, this kind of hippie and counterculture, the whole drug use, LSD, music such as the Grateful Dead, the Doors, and other artists you have in 1969, huge gathering at Woodstock. So there's this whole counterculture that's a part of the 60s as well. What ends up happening is in 1968, the Democrats are a mess. Johnson decides in 68 he's not going to seek re-election. He had become so unpopular because of his policies pursued in Vietnam that he steps aside. And it's open season for anybody who wants to be the nominee in 1968. The presumed frontrunner is this guy, the younger brother of the president in 1960, John F. Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, was an anti-war guy. He was a very liberal individual. He is, the younger brother of a popular president, and he is kind of traversing around the country, drumming up support for the primary, the Democratic primary. And while he is at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he is gunned down and killed by an individual in California because of his support for Israel. The guy who killed him, Sirhan, kills him. He's a Palestinian refugee. He's not happy with Kennedy. He's a nut job. And basically, suddenly now the Democratic Party is without its most rising, up-and-coming star. Basically, the Democrats have a lot of different choices going into this election. Uh, they have basically Eugene McCarthy, who is the anti-war guy. You have on the right Hubert Humphrey, who was the favorite of the political leadership of the Democrats. He happened to be, someone that was going to be tough on communism, but still failed to gain enough support. And what ends up happening is in 1968, they have their convention, their political convention in Chicago.
There was a riot on the streets, tell me where were you? You were sitting home watching your TV while I was participating in some anarchy. First.
And you basically have riots occurring right outside the convention, right on live TV. Police and protesters, anti-war protesters, anti-Vietnam war protesters clash, and it looks really bad. The Democratic Party is in shambles. Hubert Humphrey gets the nomination, but it's overshadowed by all this disorder. There's a lot of Democrats who don't like him because he's not anti-war. And so the Democrats are fragmented, and in 1968, the election takes place, and the Republican Party turns to trusty old Richard Nixon. The public is seeing images like this in 1968. You got the dude raising his hands, "Don't hit me, bruh." But nonetheless, in 68, with the divided Democratic Party, with a very unpopular war going on, Richard Nixon enters into the White House, makes a political comeback. He had lost in 1960, and in 68, he returns to the election and wins it. There he is with Elvis, got his famous trademark 2 fingers up. And who is this guy? He is going to be president from 1969 to 1974. You'll notice something in those years that he is not going to serve out his full two terms. He is going to have the unfortunate distinction of being the only president ever to resign from office. And in 1968, he uses his long history, his very extensive resume, and he appeals to what he calls the silent majority. Those individuals, those Americans who may not be out in the streets protesting, but support the idea of the war in Vietnam, maybe not the actual implementation of it. And he really tries to contrast himself with this radicalism, the anti-war movement he's seen as radical, the excessive government under the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, and the anti-war movement. And he's the guy who's going to kind of put a stop to this, and he appeals to those looking for some sort of sense of stability. Nixon's the guy. He's the anti-communist guy. He's the guy with the street cred in the early 50s, and he wins the election pretty easily. However, there's a lot you could say about Nixon. He is not going to be one of these big government, great society, reform, fair deal, new deal, whatever deal you want to talk about. Very limited government, Republican. But he also had, the one part I am going to focus on, is his use or abuse of power. In fact, Nixon is going to use the power of the government, the federal government, for example, the IRS and other organizations, to try to monitor and to discredit those individuals he felt were a threat to his administration. And what ends up happening is you have a group of individuals that are referred to as the plumbers, who in the hopes of President Nixon was to stop government leaks. And basically what was happening is, any democracy, in any kind of democratic system, you have freedom of information, freedom of the press. And leaks were coming out that basically, for instance, were telling the American people in the press that Nixon was authorizing the illegal bombing of Cambodia. If you've paid attention in the Vietnam lecture, Cambodia was a neutral country. He starts bombing it to get rid of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the communist guerrilla fighting. However, this was not being done publicly. Other information was leaking out, and Nixon's trying to get this under control. He had a kind of a paranoid personality in some ways. There were leaks, but he thought they ran a lot deeper than they really did. One of the things that ends up happening is a guy by the name of Daniel Ellsberg um, ends up in the middle of a controversy with the New York Times, because in 1970 the New York Times puts forth and publishes a history of the war in Vietnam from the years 1945 to 1967, well before the actual U.S. troops on the ground. And Nixon tries to get this publishing by the New York Times stopped. And the Supreme Court decides that it is protected by the First Amendment, and in spite of Nixon talking about national security and all this other stuff, it is basically released. And what the American public sees in this Pentagon Papers is a whole series of government lies, cover-ups, disinformation with regard to the war in Vietnam. And it looks bad. It's not just about Nixon, it's about Johnson and the other people as well. And Nixon wanted to keep it from stepping out into the public view, but it does become published. The plumbers, the people that Nixon had to try to take care of this type of thing, target Daniel Ellsberg. And basically they do things like break into a psychiatric office, psychiatrist office, to try to find out stuff about him, to discredit him publicly, to use information to keep him from pursuing the story. And this is just part of what Nixon's kind of doing. The Pentagon Papers are ultimately published. It reveals a secret war that was not based upon the truth, and Nixon is not too happy about it. Now, what ends up happening is he ends up creating a committee to re-elect the president called CREEP. And it was headed by his Attorney General, John Mitchell, and basically CREEP was, on the most basic level, to get President Nixon reelected in 1972. But in order to do that, it spied on Democrats, it followed people, surveillance, it used wiretapping. The plumbers would go into the Democratic National Committee's office in Watergate, Washington, D.C. to try to get information. It did a whole bunch of stuff. And what ends up happening is in June of 1972, security guards at the Watergate Hotel Democratic headquarters office buildings, it's still around today. The Democratic headquarters is in the building Watergate, and they stop some burglars trying to break into the Democratic National Convention headquarters. And of course, it becomes a big scandal. Who is the one sending in these spies, these wiretapping guys, into the Democratic National Headquarters? And of course, the Nixon administration is asked about this, and flat out, Nixon denies having anything to do with Watergate, the break-ins. Nobody, in fact, he says, in his administration had anything to do with this thing. And here's what happens. A cover-up begins. Because the reality is, there were members of the Nixon administration, including the president himself, who knew about this. And so Nixon begins a whole series of cover-ups, taking people's names out of phone directories, changing phone records, those individuals who know about it, telling them to stay quiet and giving them bribes like pardons if they are to get arrested and charged for the crime of illegally breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters. Those individuals who were against Nixon, they were used and attacked by, for example, the IRS would audit them to make their life very difficult. And this whole Watergate thing becomes a big old mess for the Nixon administration. And the question was really, what happened? Now, Nixon ends up getting reelected in 1972. Things kind of blow over, or so Nixon had hoped. And what starts occurring is people want the answers, the truth. And you actually get two journalists. They made a movie, a very popular film about these two men. Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post begin looking into this story. And they end up getting clues from an unnamed informant within the Nixon administration. And because he was unnamed, they referred to him by the name Deep Throat, which happens to be the name of a very popular pornographic film in the 70s by the same name. And what ends up happening is these two journalists, at tremendous risk to their careers and so on and so forth, end up finding out information that increasingly points to Nixon's and his administration's involvement in the Watergate break-ins and in the cover-up. And basically, a judge orders a full investigation and gets some of the people that are involved in creep to admit that the White House did know about this stuff. And it became very, very difficult to kind of deny what was going on here. And the Senate opens up investigations in February 1973 to see the extent of this abuse of power. And what the Senate's investigation reveals is that the president had used government agencies to target political opponents. For instance, like I said, the IRS auditing those people who were critical of the Nixon administration, using the FBI in various ways. And the Nixon administration was, in fact, involved in the Watergate cover-up. Now, the problem is, there was no smoking gun, as they say. There was no direct connection to Nixon. It turns out that the Senate reveals in their investigation that Nixon had a whole taping system to record every conversation in the Oval Office. And the committee within the Senate tries to get Nixon to give those tapes back, or to turn those tapes over, so they can see what's in the tapes to see if there is any conversations that Nixon recorded, because he was a paranoid guy, and Nixon refuses to hand over the tapes. He says it is his executive privilege not to give those tapes up. And of course, many people come up with their own opinions. Why is Nixon holding back? What you have happen is the Saturday night massacres, in which a bunch of people within the administration are either fired or resign from the administration. Very quickly, it begins to look extremely bad. Nixon's VP is gone for fraud, tax evasion. Nixon finally releases the tapes, but there's sections missing out of them. They're all edited. The Supreme Court gets involved. They ordered that the tapes be submitted unedited. And finally, Nixon, with the evidence kind of growing and growing and growing, 3 articles of impeachment are put before Richard Nixon in July of 1973. 3 articles of impeachment: obstruction of justice, not following and helping in the investigation of Watergate; 2, the abuse of power of the FBI and the IRS and other federal agencies; and 3, contempt to Congress for not releasing the tapes. And basically, what ends up happening is, after this continued embarrassment, in August 1974, Nixon becomes the first ever president to resign from office. The first and only. And Gerald Ford takes over the presidency. Nixon is gone. And Nixon quits the presidency. Gerald Ford becomes president. He writes a very eloquent, well thought out letter stating his intentions. I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. And he abords his helicopter. During the investigation, Nixon's famous quote, "I am not a crook," and he is gone. And it's a huge embarrassment to the office of the presidency. In fact, it was just one among many over these last few years. And Nixon fades away from the public eye. He makes a return into a TV interview. They did a whole movie about it, Frost Nixon. It doesn't look good either. That's going to close out domestic stuff. And I just want to point out there's Ford, there's Carter, there's Reagan, there's the little Bush, there is the big Bush, there's Clinton. So make sure you kind of read up on certain things. Use the Blue Book. It will help you tremendously. Hopefully, if I get around to it, I'll finish off the foreign policy lecture.